I am attorney Richard Joyal of Manchester, and on behalf of the New Hampshire Bar Foundation, I'm speaking with attorney William Brennan of Manchester today, October the 5th, 2018. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing fine, Rick.
And it's all right if I call you Bill.
Absolutely.
Since that's the only name I've ever known you by. And we apparently go back to the 1970s.
We do.
When Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jim Connor was running for office.
That's when we first met.
When I first met you.
Yeah.
So, as you know, this is an opportunity to talk about your experiences in the law and practice in the New Hampshire Bar. But I'm a little interested in some of what got you there in the first place, where you came from, and who you were before you were Attorney Brennan.
Well, I was born in Boston, and I grew up in Connecticut. I went to college at Fairfield University in Fairfield, Connecticut, and then I went on to law school in D.C. at Catholic University Law School. How we got to New Hampshire is kind of a funny story. My wife and I were very close to being near the water. And of course, as you know, Washington doesn't have very much water around it. That's a shore.
Or clean water.
Or clean, right. So we decided that we wanted to come back to New England, and we thought Maine was too far away. Massachusetts had too many lawyers. I didn't want to go back to Connecticut. Rhode Island was had a year you had to intern before you could take the bar. So I left New Hampshire. It had a 13-mile coast, and it fit the bill. So,
how did you end up going to law school?
It's something that I will tell you. It sounds kind of weird at this point, but it was something I always wanted to do, and it was something that when I was in high school, I was the president of my class, and then I was appointed in Fairfield at the university. I was appointed to be a judge on the court for the student court, and I really was excited about continuing that forward motion. So
who did you know in New Hampshire when you decided to plant yourself here?
My aunt and uncle lived actually on Oak Street in Manchester, and my uncle had died by the time we came up, but my aunt's brother was Larry Shea, who was the sheriff of Hillsborough County. And so that was my lead-in to the practice of law in New Hampshire. I was able to, I came up, I met with Larry. I met him for the purpose of being introduced to various attorneys at the Hillsborough County Superior Courthouse in the clerk's office. I don't know if you remember this or not, but there used to be a room up there in the clerk's office where everybody would just sit in chairs and hang around.
Was that the Carl Randall room?
Well, they didn't call it that at that point, but it was Carl Randall's office.
Okay.
And so Carl Randall was there, and I met Bob Murphy and Carl. And ironically, one of the people that was there was Dave Nixon, who he was just sitting waiting for a jury. And we got talking, and at that time I needed one more person to sign my application to apply to take the bar, and Dave signed it for me.
So you went to the courthouse without actually having become a member of the bar yet?
No, that's right, yeah.
That's quite a plan.
Yeah.
So you found somebody to sign off for you?
Yep, I did.
And the rest is history?
The rest is history, you
so
know.
Start with that history.
Once I was able to, I took the bar, and then I went back to D.C. I hadn't finished school yet. I went back. I finished school, but we had to move back to get things organized, and I got a phone call. It was a Friday afternoon. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was a Friday afternoon, and it was David Souter, and he said, "Bill," he said, "are you still in the job market?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, how about coming to New Hampshire and being interviewed by Warren Rudman and me?" And that was the beginning. I got interviewed by Warren Rudman and David Souter, and they hired me to be part of the Attorney General's office.
How did they find you?
I would say to you that it was probably my uncle. I called him my uncle. He really wasn't. But Larry Shea probably dropped my name And I had made the applications, and I had sent in a resume, and that caused my name to float to the top.
So you made a pretty good initial connection, didn't you?
I did. It was really good, and as a result of that, I was exposed to criminal prosecution, and there was another young man who went in at the same time I did. His name was Loren Rawson. Henry Spalis was a deputy attorney general at that time, and Loren was his nephew, and so Loren was looking for a job at the same time, and the two of us got hired by Rudman and Suter, and our job was to be roving prosecutors. We went back and forth between Rockingham County and Hillsborough County. And as a result of that, and we assisted the county attorneys in prosecution of criminal cases. As a result of that, I got to meet the county attorney up in Casey Moore. Oh, it was not actually, it was Dover. I apologize. It was Dover. Casey Moore, who was the prosecutor for Stratford County, county attorney. And then I met a guy that actually turned my life around. I met Jim Connor, who was the county attorney for Hillsborough County.
Whose name I dropped initially
Right.
when I first met you.
Yeah. He was the county attorney, and he persuaded Rudman to allow me to stay with him full time, and I worked with Jim for 3 years, and he taught me a lot. He taught me how to try a case. He taught me how to negotiate. He taught me how to to express myself to a jury, and he was a great mentor, and he was a person that I really loved very much.
Do you remember your first immersion into the middle of a trial, or a trial by yourself?
Oh yeah, that was one of the things that Connor did, which was, I don't know that they do it now, but I don't think they do. You have to understand that the county attorney's office, I think today, probably has 10 or 12 lawyers in it. Well, at that time, I was the only assistant. So, and Jim was part-time. He wasn't a full-time county attorney. He was part-time, and so he would have a stack of files, and they would be indictments. And we'd meet each other at the courthouse on Monday morning, and he would give me a stack of files, and he'd say, "Go to courtroom 1." And that's how I started. I went to courtroom 1. I picked the first file, and I started my first trial.
Do you remember who the judge was?
You know, I think it may have been John King, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I know who that is.
Yeah, I thought you would. He was very gentle with me because he knew I was brand new, but he was also a good teacher, and it was kind of fun to be in his courtroom. He was really, well, you know him because of your relationship with him. So
I think his nickname was Hanging John at the time, or something like that.
Yeah, well, he was pretty hard on criminals, no question about it.
So 3 years there, and then where did that take you?
Jim decided to run for governor, which is when we met, and I left the county attorney's office, and I went to 15 North Street, where Jim's office was, and he rented me a room for $100 a month. And I would go, I'll never forget the first day. I was now no longer a criminal prosecutor. It was my first day of practice. And I went to the office, I went into the room, and I sat there, and the phone didn't ring, and I didn't, what am I going to do now? Just sit here? And so I said, well, I'm probably going to need stamps. So I got in the car and I drove down to the post office, which is now the Divine Millimet office, but at that time it was the United States Post Office. And I walked into the post office and I bought a roll of stamps. And I'm walking out of the post office and I meet a guy named Mike O'Shaughnessy. And Mike at that time was a city prosecutor for Manchester. And he, I tell him, I said, "Hey, Mike," I said, "this is my first day of private practice." I said, "I'm out on my own." And he said, "Great." He said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "Nothing." And he looked at me, he said, well, he said, I have a commitment and I need someone to take up, to cover for me at the Manchester District Court as a prosecutor. Can you do that for me? And I said, I sure can. He said, it only pays $75. And I said, 75 is better than zero, Mike. And
So what do they do, deputize you for a day as a city prosecutor?
That's what they did. Yeah. Bill O'Neill was the judge. He swore me in, and I prosecuted for a day. And then things just started to roll. I took some of Jim's cases, and then I started to, because of my connection with the county attorney's office for those 3 years, I got to meet a lot of the police chiefs in the county. And once they knew and meet the judges, quite frankly, of the various district courts in the county. Yeah. Once they found out that I was on my own, they started sending me court-assigned cases. And my wife and I would go to the office on Saturday morning. They always arrived on Saturday morning. And I'd open up the cases and I'd stack them up. And, you got paid $10 an hour. And they were all over the county. One of the funny things was that the lawyers over in Peterborough, they didn't like, as they said, coming over the mountain. They didn't like to have to drive over the mountain to visit their clients at the jail.
Valley Street Jail.
Valley Street Jail. Yeah. And so I got all these cases where all the defendants were at the Valley Street Jail. And one day, I'm opening up these files, and I put them, I'd stack them, robbery or burglary or trespass or whatever it might be. And my wife and I are going through it, and I open it up, and I take one, and it goes, murder. And I went, what?
Wow.
And it was a murder case. And, I had tried cases. I had tried a lot of criminal cases as a prosecutor, but I had never tried anything as heavy as a murder case. And so that was my first murder case, and I ended up having, I tried that case to a hung jury, and then tried it again to a not guilty, and then I tried a third one. So those are pretty much turning points in my legal career because of the reputation that I built as a result of those trials.
So in recent years, you were, I think, predominantly involved in domestic relations and divorce cases. And in that regard, how did your practice evolve through a system where you were so immersed in criminal practice?
I always liked the criminal practice. I liked the challenge of the juries and getting trials ready and interviewing witnesses and lining them up and putting your case in. I met a lot of good defense lawyers. One of the people that I met was a guy named Steve Gordon, and he was a U.S. attorney up here in Concord. And he introduced me to the federal practice, and that was a whole different other kettle of fish, much more significant and stricter than the state practice. So he and I tried a number of cases in Concord and in Boston, criminal defense work. And then there came a point in time where I remember turning to him. We were coming out of Boston, and my client had 65 counts against him, and he got found guilty on 64 of them. And I really didn't think that he should have been found guilty, but there wasn't anything I could do about it. So I started driving up with Steve back up to Manchester, and I said to him, I think I've just about had it. I think I'm finished with this practice. And so I came back up to Manchester. At that point, I had my own office, and I had people working for me, and domestic cases started coming in. And you do what you do to make money.
So you just touched on a thing that I think is of interest to most practitioners, and that is the effect of losing and the effect on the direction that you take, either as a consequence of or not. So talk about a little about how the effects of losing were dealt with, because I haven't met an attorney yet who's won every case that they've ever been
Well, I
involved
think that one of the things as a trial lawyer, especially if you're doing criminal defense work, is that you have to anticipate or expect that you're not going to win every case. But when in the federal system, it was much more significant because they had guidelines for sentencing.
I remember them.
And so, this fellow whose case I lost, he had no prior record, nothing. And it was all paper. It was, that he was convicted of. It was a case that involved financing. At that time, there was a problem in mortgages and applying for mortgages. And I really always felt that he got suckered, that he got sucked in by people who were smarter than he was. But it didn't matter. The jury didn't care. And he was found guilty, and the guidelines set the sentence. He went to federal prison for, I think it was close to 3 years. And that really gets you, when you see your client walk away and, you've done everything you can. You fought as hard as you can for him. And in your heart, you know that he's really not a bad person, and he's not a guy that should be in federal prison anyways. And he had family and had a wife and kids, and it was a sad moment. And you begin to look back and say, okay, so is there something that you did wrong? Is there something that you could have done that would have been better? And what I finally concluded was that it wasn't that I did anything wrong. It was just that, the time and the system and the way it was running just was not working for us. And so that caused me to really reconsider how much more I wanted to do this for people. But the thing that's interesting about the criminal law is the opportunity, and this is probably important for young practitioners. I had an opportunity that I don't think is available to them anymore. I talked about getting court-assigned cases. I'm not sure that they even give court-assigned cases anymore. I think the public defender does all that kind of work. And it was, I actually voted against the public defender coming into Hillsborough County. And, Jim, I'm blanking on his name. He was in this school. He was a professor in this school.
Jim Duggan.
Duggan, thank you, Jim Duggan.
Justice Duggan.
Yeah. That's right. Jim, I remember talking to Jim, and I remember, he came with Paul Lawrence to talk to Hillsborough County about bringing the county attorney, bringing the public defender's office into Hillsborough County, and it was at a bar meeting. And I stood up and said, I'm not sure I'm for this. I said, taking court-assigned cases taught me how to try a case. And it was, there was plenty of them. And it taught me how to pick a jury and what to look for. And it taught me how to talk to a judge. It taught me how to take my client through the system and take them out on the other side. Sometimes you'd win, sometimes you'd lose. But the fact of the matter is that court-assigned work gave you that opportunity that I don't think is there anymore. And Duggan understood. He understood what I was saying, but I was a weed in the wind. It didn't matter because they were coming in and they were going to start their practice, and they did. And they did do a good job. And I would not want to ever criticize the public defender's office because I think they save a lot of people. It's just that it took away from the general practitioner the opportunity to do it. I guess as time went on, interestingly enough, lawyers didn't do what I did. They didn't like doing the criminal court-assigned stuff, and so it really didn't hurt them that badly. But for me, it was a different story.
Do you attribute these changes in the system to increases in populations or the change of culture, or do you think either in addition to or because of the actions of lawyers themselves that these changes have occurred?
Boy, that's a big question. I I think the best way for me to answer that question is to do it from today, 2018, and look back. And I think that the changes that I've seen have been caused by the community pressures on lawyers. This is going to sound kind of strange, but when I first started, then again, when I first started, I was referred to as Attorney Brennan. That's what I was called, Attorney Brennan, and there was a degree of great respect for lawyers, and this is back in the late '70s, early '80s, and I was introduced as Attorney Brennan. I'm not sure that respect is there anymore. I think that a number of things have caused that to become tarnished for lawyers. I think that you have the traditional problems, which are the bad apples in the barrel that give a bad image to the practice. But then you have just the whole concept that lawyers are out to only honor themselves, that they're not dedicated to their clients, and I don't think that's true. I think that a lawyer's job is to serve his client and to make it work, and I think that image has gone away, and that's sad.
To what extent, if any, do you attribute that to advertising?
I have to say to you that I attribute a lot to advertising. I remember when advertising was first introduced into New Hampshire. It's funny, we should even talk about this. I was talking to my wife about it the other day. The other day I saw this ad on the television for a lawyer, and it was a lawyer bragging about what he could accomplish for you. And you didn't brag about what you could accomplish for people. Your reputation was all you needed to tell people what you could accomplish for them. It was that reputation that brought people into your office. I actually was very much against advertising. I thought it diminished the practice. I thought it belittled lawyers. It made us car salesmen, and it placed us into a position where we were. How do I want to say this? It placed us into a position where we were trying to get money from people by talking fast and by pulling, all sorts of image, television image things, and that's what lawyers shouldn't look like. That's how I feel.
And when I asked you earlier about the role or the responsibility for that lawyers have, is it the lawyers' fault, or at least a percentage of them, that these changes were made?
No, you know what I think, Rick? I think that, and this is true. When I first came into New Hampshire, there were 1,500 lawyers in the whole state. I tell people now there are 1,500 lawyers down in Hampshire Plaza. I think the Sheehan firm might have 1,500 lawyers in it. But 1,500 lawyers in the whole state, and so the competition wasn't as significant or as severe as it is today. And so I think young lawyers going out today have this competition that, and whenever you get competition instilled in people, they have to look for some way of making themselves stand out. And that's where the advertisement came in. That's where advertising was brought in. And so I understand why young lawyers think it's okay, because it makes them, stand out in the crowd. But unfortunately, it doesn't give you it doesn't shine the talents that lawyers have and make those shining talents the thing that draws a person into your office. That's what competition does, and it's disturbing to me to see the ads on television, to see what's taking place. I mean, you open up a Law Weekly. They still call it Law Weekly, Law Journal. A week.
The Bar Association publication.
Right. You open that up and it's loaded with ads, you know,
Yeah.
you know, I look at it and I say to myself, why? What does that publication do? Who sees that? And I would say 85% to 90% of the readers of that journal are lawyers. So who are they talking to? Are they, who are they advertising to? Are they soliciting business from other lawyers? I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me, but it waters it down. In my opinion, it waters down the effectiveness and the image of lawyers. And I just don't think I don't think that it was. I think it was a crack in the wall that has expanded so far that it is now probably making it very difficult for people to practice.
And speaking of practice, what are the things you've observed have changed the most about the practice over the length of your career? And how many years have you been practicing now, Bill?
Boy, over 35. And it's I think one of the things that I talk about the change of practice is the relationship between lawyers, the friendliness of them. When I first started, I joined the Manchester Bar Association, and the Manchester Bar Association was a group of lawyers that would meet once a month, and you would get to meet and talk to lawyers openly and candidly about what was going on. And you know what, Rick, you didn't have an issue about whether they were going to steal a client from you, or they were going to compete with you, or they were going to somehow interfere with your practice. You went there because you were looking for help. I mean, I can remember sitting, having a glass of beer with Stanley Brown and Carl Randall, and just talking about the practice and listening to them, and what they talked about what it was, what caused them to be lawyers, and that was pretty impressive to have that opportunity. And to be able to be with those kinds of people. I mean, that's the luck I had. I grew up at a time when these names were so prominent. They're so prominent now when you go back in the history of the Bar Association, and I knew them all, and they took you in, and they taught you things, Tom Tessier, someone who you know well. Sent me a case out of a Bar Association meeting that it was a case that he didn't want to do anymore. It was going to be more complicated. I was brand new, and it turned out that it was a case in which it was an estate case. I had never done an estate case before, and so I said, okay. So I took it. And I started learning what probate court was about. I'd done criminal trials, I'd done civil trials, I had done some divorce work, but never probate. So I started to get involved. And Tessier sent me this case, and it was interesting. It had a business in it, and it was a gumball machine business. And it was the only asset in the estate. And the guy who died had a sister. And she was handicapped, and she was really very badly handicapped, and the decedent had supported her all her life, and now she didn't have anybody to help her, and the only thing that she had that was of any value was this business, And everybody was telling me that I should put the estate into bankruptcy and just auction off the business. And instead, I decided that, first off, she wouldn't get the money that I thought she could get for the business. So I started running a gumball machine business out of my office. And I sold gumballs. I had a guy who would, I don't know if you...
Forgive the phrase. So how'd that work out for you?
It worked out pretty good. There was a guy who filled up the machines. I assume you know what they are. They're these balls that, these machines you put a penny in and you get a gumball out of them.
Yeah.
Well, you have to fill those things, and you have to collect the pennies. And what I found was that it was, at that time, a primary source of pennies for the local banks. And so I got to know the president of the Bank of New Hampshire because he wanted the pennies from the vending company. And I got to know him, and so I would sell him the pennies, and then he would come back, and I had a great relationship with him. And this other man went out and filled the gumball machines, and I got the business running, and I sold it, and I made a profit on it, and I gave the money to this lady, and she ended up having having some money in her pocket to be able to support herself, and so it didn't go bankrupt. But that's the kind of experience you would get that I recall getting by being part of the Bar Association and by associating with lawyers. Everybody was out to help. No one was out to hurt. They all wanted to make sure you did okay. When I stood up and said I was going to start my own private practice, the group cheered me. Now, poor guys out there now, I don't
feeling sorry for you.
Yeah. Now I don't think they even think about going to these association meetings, and that's too bad.
Do you think that's a product of the size of the bar as well?
Yeah, I do.
People don't know one another as well as a consequence?
They don't know it, and they don't trust each other. I don't know where that came from. When did you stop trusting other lawyers? When did you stop believing in what they had to say? When did you have to do a double check to make sure that when a lawyer said he was going to do something, he did it? I don't know when that started, but I understand it's going on now, today, that you just can't, that if you have a client and the client says, well, what's going to happen with ABC? You can't just turn to them and say, well, the lawyer on the other side said, this is what he's going to do for ABC, and that's going to get done. Now the client doesn't believe you. He doesn't think that's going to happen, or she doesn't think that's going to happen. And how do you trust it? And and it's based on trust. It's based on the ability to trust the word of the lawyer. And that's the thing that scares me now, that today's practice, that trust seems to have completely vaporized, and trusting the word of a lawyer amongst lawyers is weak. And I hear, I still have an office. I still have 5 or 6 lawyers in my office, and I hear them talk. I'll have a cup of coffee with them, and they'll tell me about problems they're having with other attorneys, problems that I never experienced before when I first started. So I don't know. It's not, it's funny though. When I was talking about Stanley Brown and Carl Rando, that's what they were complaining about. I remember that. I remember sitting at that table, and they were complaining that lawyers were not being friendly with each other and not being socialized with each other, and a concern that the younger lawyers were going to were not responding as they should. As it turned out, I think I did respond as I should, but I thought it's funny in retrospect that they had the same reaction that I'm having right now.
Do you see the judicial system itself changing in a way that systematizes things much more than the more personalized environment that you worked in the early years of your career?
Oh, sure. I mean, in the Superior Court, there were 8 judges in the whole state. You knew every single judge. You tried cases in front of every single judge. And to be honest with you, Rick, they knew your name. Today, I don't even know how many judges there are today in the Superior Court. And then the circuit court is a whole different animal. When I was growing up in the law, the circuit court was your local district court. And there were people like Billy O'Neill and Armin Campbell-Street were the judges. And they were good judges, and you would try your cases in front of them, but you knew them, and they knew you. There was a personal connection. And I think, I hate to sound like a whiner on this, but I think that's kind of what's being lost, is that personal connection between lawyers and judges. And I don't even know what the relationship is with clerks anymore. But it was always a good relationship, as far as I know, between the clerks, the lawyers, and the judges. And it paid off. It was I guess sometimes they call it the good old boy system, and I hate to hear that, because I really never felt that I was given a break because I was part of the system. I always felt that I was being taken care of by my elders, people who were sensitive to the fact that I needed to learn things too, and they were willing to teach them to me.
This leads into the electrification or the digitization of the practice in terms of the lawyer's connection to the system, the introduction of e-filing systems. What do you foresee that will do to the tide, or the direction of the tide that you've talked about, in less personalization and more systematization?
It's going to increase the distance between lawyers, courts, and judges. It's all electronic. You don't. I read recently that has taken place now in Hillsborough County, and Rick, I remember my first writ of summons that I ever drafted. I had no idea how to draft a writ of summons. I didn't know how to do it. And so there was a woman in the sheriff's office she had been there for years and years and years and years. I went down and talked to her. She helped me draft my first writ of summons. I'm not sure that young lawyers have that ability anymore to do that kind of stuff without feeling embarrassed, And now, if you do it electronically, you don't even go to the clerk's office to talk to somebody there. I mean, I wrote the writ and I went down and I filed it. I filed it in the clerk's office, and it was, you just don't have that connection. So it sounds like I'm talking about, that the practice is going to hell in a handbasket. I'm not sure that it is. I think that what I am saying is that if I had an ability to wave a wand across the group, I would do it to make them talk to each other and support each other and be lawyers and friends with each other, as opposed to combatants or arguing with each other or debating with each other, or things that I hate when I hear other lawyers referring to lawyers in negative names. That's just terrible.
What do you perceive the image looks like for judges who do not know the lawyers that are coming before them, because there isn't that regularity of exposure to one another in the courtroom itself?
Yeah, that's funny you should say that. I talked to you about John King being the first judge. I mean, John King was a tough man to try a case in front of. But you know what? He respected you. And if you earned the respect of a judge like John King, you felt pretty good about yourself. And he would, I can remember him, taking me up to the bench and telling me, Bill, you shouldn't do it that way, you should do it this way. Now, can you imagine? I don't think that it would even cross a judge's mind today to give guidance to a lawyer about what to do or how to do something. But when I was doing it, judges would do that. They were older than you. They had more experience than you. They knew that your trial work was brand new, or you were involved in things that may have been over your head a little bit, and they would help you. Marty Laughlin was a judge that I will never forget. I mean, he was just a wonderful man, and he was a real gentleman. And I tried my first murder case in front of Marty Laughlin, and he called me to the bench and he said, "Bill, do you realize that that you are entitled to have 2 lawyers appointed to represent someone in murder?" I said, "No, I had no idea." But that's the kind of stuff, that I didn't know.
Do you think the current or modern era judges are a little afraid? And that may not be a fair question to ask, but do you think that they approach with some trepidation their unfamiliarity with the lawyers and therefore not knowing who to trust and what not to say as opposed to what to say?
Okay, here's a good example. One of my closest friends as a judge was a guy named Ken McHugh. And Kenny, I talked to you about 15 North Street. Well, Ken worked for the other attorney that was in 15 North Street, Imo Boussier. And I got to know Ken very, very well because he and I we were in offices next door to each other. And then he became a district court judge, and then he became a superior court judge. He used to talk to me about an issue of bringing people into chambers and talking to them. And he had a very open relationship with lawyers. And he would bring you in, and it was really interesting the way he put it. When you walked into his chambers, he would refer to it as being his house. You're in my house now. So what we talk about here today is going to be, we're going to both learn from each other. And we're going to both do things positively together. And, I think that experience with a judge, that connection to a judge, really is a positive thing for a lawyer. I'm not comfortable that the new judges that are being appointed have ever had that experience, have ever seen that happen, or maybe even more importantly, have the courage to trust it. That was the thing that Ken did. He trusted that you as a lawyer would respect his confidence as he respected yours. And consequently, I think there are judges now, because they don't have the connection to the lawyers anymore, or it's not all of them, but some of them don't have the connection to the lawyers, don't have that level of trust with them. As a result, they don't bring them into chambers, or they do everything on the record, and they do it to protect themselves. Well, how defensive is that? And what does that teach a lawyer, about a judge, or vice versa? So I think there's a problem there.
So we're perhaps getting ahead of ourselves, but where do you think it's going? Do you think, well, just maybe that's the question. Where do you think it's going relative to trials and litigation and the traditional process that we have exercised over the decades?
I think we're going to see the elimination of the trial as we know it today. I don't think we're going to have lawyers in the well, if you will, arguing legal points. I think we're going to have more paper, less contact, less exposure to the community and the people. I think it's going to be more rote and more difficult to become involved in a courtroom. I think that's going to go away.
Do you attribute that to alternative dispute resolution? And if so, do you think that ADR is nevertheless a worthwhile aspect of resolving cases?
Hey, the domestic work I did, ADR was the key. You had to do it, and it was important to do it. And I was a mediator. I did mediation work, and I found it very positive to do that. I'm not sure ADR is the death knell to trials, because it doesn't eliminate the trial. It just, what it can do, and I'm concerned that it isn't, is it can narrow the issues so that you could have, an issue of liability versus 10,000 issues of fault. One issue. It can narrow it down for the court and for the jury to understand. ADR also does what I think is important. It brings lawyers together to reach common ground and relationships and agreement. That's a positive thing. That's not a negative thing.
One of the things I didn't ask you much about was some of the more memorable cases and personalities that you engaged with through those cases over the years. And I'm interested in knowing some of the more colorful war stories that you've accumulated over the decades.
Well, I think that, I'm not sure I'm going to be very good with you on that. I had a lot of friends who practiced law, and we would, it was always, for me, it was always fun. I never really, I always liked my job. I always liked what I did. I liked the people I was with. I liked the lawyers. And I liked socializing with them. I think that's an interesting thing. People always say that they don't necessarily like to socialize with lawyers. I heard that once, and I said, "Why not? Who the hell else would you talk to?" I mean, I love talking to lawyers. Everybody's got another idea. Everybody's got another concept. So people that I know. I've mentioned a number of them. Kenny McHugh, John King, Molevi was a judge who I remember very well. He used to smoke cigarettes, and he would hold the cigarette in his teeth like this, and he would talk to you like that. And one day I was in the clerk's office, and I had a motion that I needed a hearing continued. And Molevi was this kind of a judge. I walked in and gave the motion to Carl Randall, and Molevi reached over and grabbed the motion. I explained to Randall why I needed the continuance. He reached over and he grabbed the motion, and he wrote on it, and he went, "Denied." Now, when he's doing this, he's got the cigarette in his teeth, and he gives it back to Randall. And Randall looks at me and he says, "Granted." And it was just his action. That's what Molevi would do. He would do those things just to see how you'd react to it. He was a good judge. I tried a couple cases with him. It's funny. If I had names put in front of me, I could tell you stories. I don't necessarily remember them all now.
Well, you've had a few cases that were fairly significant in the annals of New Hampshire litigation and law. You should talk about a couple of those, or at least one of them that you think not only was significant to you, but was significant beyond you as well.
I think one of the cases that I will always remember is the case in which I sued the IRS. No one had ever sued the IRS. The story begins, there's a good friend of mine, his name is Rick Maloney. He's an accountant. He's still doing that work here in Manchester now. And my daughter went to Northwestern, and Rick's daughter went to the son went to the University of Chicago. And we were bringing their books and their bags and all this stuff out to Chicago. So we rented a truck, and we drove from Manchester to Chicago. And on the way, Rick started telling me a story. And it was a story about a lawyer who had died. he was not, he was a single practitioner, and he fell into that trap that single practitioners often fall into, which is paying themselves without setting aside the taxes for the income taxes for the money, for the payment. And so the IRS came down, and they came down hard on him, and they put liens on everything, on his house, on everything, and he committed suicide, and he left a note, and the note said he committed suicide because of the IRS, and he had a wife and he had a daughter, and Rick was telling me the story, and the story was that the IRS were now coming after the wife for the money, and they were going to foreclose on the house and seize her house. She was a librarian. I mean, she had nothing to do with this problem, and they wouldn't listen to her. And Rick was a really good negotiator with the IRS, and he told me that they kept slamming the door in his face. They wouldn't do it. And I said to them, I said, that's ridiculous. I said, how can they get away with that? And so we drove to Chicago. We talked about it. We drove back to Chicago. We continued to talk about it. I got back. I met the woman. She was a sweetheart, and she was so gentle. And we talked, and she would cry, and she was upset because they were now about to foreclose on her house. So I thought the only thing I could do is try to stop them. So I went to federal court, and I filed a writ of summons against the IRS, and I sued them for the abuse that they were causing her. And
what was the theory? Intentional infliction of emotional distress?
Exactly. You know, and that they were, and I'll never forget the day. Jim Muirhead, who was a judge at the federal court system, a magistrate, sat to weed out the cases, before they went into the federal system, before they went in front of a judge.
Lucky you.
Yeah, I really was lucky that I got Jim Muirhead. And I'm sitting in a room in the federal court building. Now, if you've not been in the federal court building, you don't really understand what I'm about to describe to you. But the federal court building is like an armory. It's like a fort. You go in, and the rooms have no windows in them. And I'm sitting there, and there's one other person that's there. And the purpose of this, for me being there, is to have this first conference with the judge.
Magistrate Muirhead?
Yeah, Magistrate Muirhead. It's the first conference on this case. And so I figured this lawyer must be coming for the government. So, I did what I always did. I said, hi, my name's Bill Brennan. I said, are you here with the government? And he goes, yes, I am. And he was very abrupt. And I said, well, how about if we get together and we just make a list of things that we're gonna present to him? I know he wants us to agree on facts and agree on things like that. This guy turned to me and he said, are you crazy? He said, we're going to go into that room and this case is going to be thrown out. No one sues the IRS. No one does that. I'm not going to do that with you. And I said, okay. So I sat down, and the case got called. And I walked into the room, and Jim Muirhead, who was sitting behind his desk, stands up and he says, Billy, how are you? And he shakes my hand. And at that point, the whole conversation changed. And Muirhead said, let's have a list now of the things you're going to agree to. This lawyer was so flabbergasted. He came out of Boston. He had no idea, and he started to argue with Muirhead about this case can't go forward. There's no jurisdiction for this. You can't sue the IRS. And Muirhead turned to him and said, well, we're going to find out, aren't we? And so we did. And what I discovered in this was the power of the press. And the union leader was, how do I want to put this? At that time, there was a thing going through Congress, and it was called the taxpayers' rights.
Taxpayers' rights.
That's what it was. And it was a bill that was going through Congress. And I jumped on board of that. And
Good timing.
it was. And this, the union leader grabbed this case like a raw bone, and they just loved it. And they couldn't get enough of it. And they put headlines in the paper about it. They had lots of publicity about it, and so it just grew and grew and grew, and finally it came to a point where the government was being attacked, because I also went to Judge Gregg, and I told him about it. And whenever you told the story to people, they all got upset, because here's this poor woman with her little daughter, who's losing her house, and she's a librarian. I mean, the image was perfect, and Judge Gregg got upset about it, and he started putting pressure on the IRS. And the next thing I knew, I got a phone call from the IRS, and they wanted to know if I wanted to settle. And I said, sure, I'll talk settlement with you. And so,
shall we make a list now?
so of course I made an outrageous demand. We're not going to pay you that much money and all this other stuff. Well, I think my legal bill was like $45,000 or $50,000. So I said, take the lien off, take it off the property, take it out of the registry, get rid of anything about it, and pay me my legal fees. And so they said they would. And they gave me a check, and I gave it to the woman. I didn't keep the money. I gave it to her, and they took all the liens off, and they did what had to be what was the right thing to do. But the interesting thing was that unfortunately my mother was dying at this point. I had been down to Connecticut, but there was a press conference that was being held up in Manchester, and it was a press conference for the case, and the union leader wanted me present at it. So I left my poor mother, and I drove up to Manchester, and I went to this press conference, and I took advantage, because the federal government wouldn't say anything. They said they couldn't talk about the case. So I just talked about it, and I said, they backed down, we won the case, to this, and I explained what happened, and the union leader ran with it, and that was a good thing. It was a good turning point.
Happily ever after.
It really was. And I see her every once in a while. Oh, yeah. And, because Rick still does her taxes. And I see her, and she's really a lovely person, and we laugh about those moments. It's good.
So in the last few minutes that we have, I'd like to ask you a little about running your own law firm. What that was like, and what you learned from it, and how you learned. It's a pretty big question, but talk about that a little bit before we complete.
I hung a shingle out, and I started to practice. I had my secretary was my wife for a while, and then I hired a secretary. It is hard to do, and I'm not sure if it can be done today or not. I kind of hope it can, but I had some background because my father ran his own business, so I kind of knew how to set up a business, and that's what I did. I set this law practice up. I knew how to keep books. I knew how to keep track of money and how to pay bills. I knew how to type. I knew how to purchase things. And once you got into a role on it, you began to hire people to help you do those things. Right now, there's a woman who's still working for me today. Her name is Pat Kucher. She started working for me back in 1980, and she's still working for me now. And she was my office manager back then, and she's the office manager today. She is excellent at this stuff. And so you begin to understand how to do it. I would never tell a lawyer today to go out and just do it without help. You need to have support. And it's difficult because it's hard to understand how can I afford to tell someone else that I'm going to pay them a salary when I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to pay myself a salary? And that stress creates problems. But in the end, you make it work, you make it happen. And if you get the right people with you that are willing to go with you on that, you can start building the practice. And all of a sudden the clients start coming in and you realize you've got more work than you can handle. And so you hire a lawyer and that lawyer starts working and they begin to have more work. It's a building block process, and that's how I did it.
Final question. To lawyers who are the head of firms and have either younger or basically other people working for them or under them or with them, what do you think is the most important thing to keep in mind when you're either managing or directing these people that are practicing law with you or under you?
Talk to them. Go into their offices, sit down with them, find out if they're having problems, see if you can help them identify the problems and get around the problems. The biggest thing that an older lawyer can do for a younger lawyer is talk to him or her and to give as much guidance from experience as you can. They need it. They need it in order to get through the system. And you don't want them to trip up. You don't want them to get into trouble with it. We didn't talk about one thing. I was on the professional conduct committee for 10 years. That taught me a lot. It taught me what not to do and what to do. It taught me that when a phone call came in, answer it. Return the phone call. When you get back to your office and you've got a fistful of messages, call them. Call the people. Talk to your clients. Let them know what's going on.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Great, Rick. It's been great being with you. Thanks.